This is RiverTalks with Jonathan Brush, President and CEO of Unbound.
Recently, I had a conversation with Andrew Pudawa. And fortunately for you, we recorded that conversation. You can find it over at the Be Unbound podcast, and definitely check it out because it was a cool conversation. And we covered some really neat stuff in there. And Andrew's just one of those people that when you talk to him, you can't help become much smarter after that conversation. And that's certainly what happened to me. But at some point in that conversation, Andrew mentioned something I thought was pretty interesting. And he said, it's interesting these days that rarely do people have hobbies. And he referred to his father. And he said his father was really infatuated with model airplanes as Andrew was growing up, and then switched that infatuation over to racing. And so raced sailboats, and just talked about the amount of joy that brought his father, but also that it was an outlet for his father's engineering mind. And we went on and had a long conversation about that. But it got me thinking about the same thing. As I was growing up, my father had some hobbies, not model airplanes. In his case, it was more rifles and shooting and hunting. But he had a really close friend who was very influential in my life, continues to be influential in my life, who was a shooter and into model airplanes and all those kinds of things. And he's right. I think there is a decrease in some sense in hobbies, but it's not just a decrease in hobbies. I think that there's a bit of certainly not a scorn, I don't know if it goes that high, but there's a skepticism about hobbies these days. It's almost like, why would you possibly pursue a hobby when you should be taking that time and doing a side hustle or starting a business? So the uber productive crowd is like, don't waste your time on a hobby when you could be wasting your time, or you could be using that same time doing something that would pay you money. And then there's another crowd that maybe not the uber productive crowd that doesn't have a hobby because they're spending so much time clicking through social media or watching YouTube videos or something of that nature. Now, I'm not suggesting that nobody has hobbies these days. What I am suggesting is that having a hobby can be more beneficial than it looks like at first glance. And I found this recently. I have lots of hobbies, so I wasn't in the camp of people that don't have hobbies. And in fact, part of my problem is I have too many hobbies. I like to go camping and backpacking and canoeing and fishing and hunting and shooting and all those things. But a couple of years ago, I hit a place where Unbound was really at a place that required a lot of attention. There was a lot of stress and a lot of stuff running that. And it wasn't necessarily bad stress. It just was taking a lot of time. It was taking a lot of my concentration. We had a lot of house projects going on. It was taking a lot of concentration. I had parenting responsibilities. It's just a busy time. There's lots going on. And a lot of those things are blessings. But as I've related in a couple of places and mentioned a little bit in the podcast with Andrew, I don't know how infectious COVID is, but I can tell you that motorcycles are at least 10 times as infectious as COVID, because my oldest son's friend bought a motorcycle. And in fairly short order, my son had bought a motorcycle. A lot of his friends had bought a motorcycle. And we had the beginnings of a pretty solid motorcycle gang meeting at my house at certain nights of the week. And so as I relay the story, I did what any reasonable, responsible father would do. And I also bought a motorcycle and got my motorcycle license clearly so that I could speak wisdom and good thinking into the lives of these young men. At least that's what I told my wife, who saw right through that and yet was gracious enough to endorse my motorcycle madness myself. And so I bought this motorcycle, and I had never ridden before. Of course, I'd ridden bicycles, but I wasn't a motorcycle rider. And so I had to learn all of it. And let me tell you something. Learning to ride a motorcycle, it's not that it's wildly difficult. It's just that the stakes are rather high. You have to ride correctly, or the consequences can be a little rough. And so it's something that requires you to pay attention. And I found something interesting. I was at a point in my life where I was really busy, and I was really concentrating on all these things. And of course, it was exhausting work. And then I found that I was having to learn to do this motorcycle riding, so I was trying to keep up with my son. And so it wasn't an option. I had to get ready for the class, and then I had to take the class, and I had to practice to be able to take the test to pass to get my endorsement, my license endorsement. And I was taking, 20 minutes that almost all of a sudden I had to take to ride. And in that 20 minutes, I forgot everything else that was going on. I concentrated entirely on what I was doing because I had to. It was something I hadn't done before. So I had to, it was all new skills, and I was having to learn how to work the throttle and work the clutch and find the brake and lean correctly and position my body and squeeze the knees and all the stuff that you have to do to ride a motorcycle. And it was totally engrossing, and I would come back totally and completely refreshed. And not only that, but I started to notice something else. The work that I was doing in my job was becoming sharper in some ways, that I was concentrating better, that I was more rested for certain things, that I was getting better perspective. In other words, having this hobby wound up making me much more productive, and the quality of my work went up significantly in my normal job. And I think that happens sometimes. And I don't know why it exactly happened, but I think I have some guesses. It made me think differently. It gave me a new perspective. It gave me a lot of rest. It gave me something else to concentrate on. It gave me more patience and that gave me new interest in life because I was able to concentrate on something else. And altogether, it ended up just being a really fun hobby to get into. I found that with the motorcycle, roads around our house that I've been driving for years and years and years, and I could practically sleep drive, all of a sudden became really interesting because in a motorcycle, you had to completely look at them differently and figure out how to put the lean angle correct and work the throttle. If you go into any turn in a motorcycle, there's like 13 things you're supposed to think about. And I found all that just fascinating. So my advice and my conclusion from all that is not so much to ride motorcycles, although I endorse it. It was a lot of fun and it is a lot of fun, but to not sneer at hobbies, to understand that that's part of the creativity that comes from being made in the image of God. And that there's just sheer joy and pleasure in doing some of those things. There's also skill to be gained. And I think ultimately you'll find that it bleeds over into the rest of your life, that there's perspective, that there is rest, that there is concentration that you will gain from having concentrated on something else besides something that is surely practical, that just advances your career, makes you money, or is something that's totally rational. So my encouragement to do something relaxing, do something fun, and don't sneer at getting into a hobby.